So, My Hero Academia, huh? I don't like the way female characters are treated in My Hero Academia. That's the gist of all this. Now, not just the treatment wholesale. I actually think MHA is notable for the presence of a diverse group of female characters. Class 1A is not half and half guys and girls, but out of the 20 students, there are 6 girls. This might sound kind of meager, especially considering one of them is actually invisible. Apparently, Sue and Toru were conceived as male characters, so at least we didn't get a 20-4 ratio. But compared to a lot of the other shonen shows I love, looking at you, Hunter x Hunter, and all the sports anime I adore, these shows have some great female characters, but they're not a large part of the cast, and that's frustrating. But My Hero Academia is full of female characters, heroes, villains, and I enjoy watching their part in the adventure. Still, there's 2 things that really get me about the female characters in the show, and they really get me. The sexist objectification of the young women of My Hero Academia, which is not only distasteful, but also a distraction from the main story, and the constant sidelining and lack of development for the female cast. Before I go any further, I want to say I love My Hero Academia. I think it's one of the greatest shonen of the past few decades. I have had so much fun watching this show. Bones did a fantastic job on the adaptation, no surprise, and the story is well-paced, action-packed, full of memorable and compelling characters. You know, it's a great show. Also, I think MHA deserves a shout-out for including a mother character, Inko, who is alive and a part of Deku's life, which is just, thank you, MHA. Thank you for having a living, present, caring mom for our hero. You are in an elite club for that. I'd also like to say that MHA is pretty notable for having 2 trans supporting characters, the hero Tiger, a trans man, and the villain Magne, a trans woman. Because this is in part a discussion of gender representation in shonen manga, I think that these characters are important to mention and celebrate, so I'm going to do that right here. Full disclosure that I am cis, so mostly I want to cover this because I think it's important, and I think it would be wrong to not cover the series Trans Woman in a video about women in MHA. For Tiger, I don't think his trans identity is mentioned outside the manga, and only then briefly in an extra, but he was able to fully transition. For Magne, that's not the case, and I've read opinions from trans fans with different takes of how well her representation is handled. I'm cis myself, so I don't want to center my take, but there seems to be points for it having good and bad elements. On one hand, it's interesting to have a trans character who doesn't pass, maybe because hero society is structured in a way that villains and poorer people don't have access to resources like gender-affirming surgery that heroes or the wealthy do. We see that lack of access in our own non-superhero society. On the other hand, Magne is a villain, and she, the only trans character you can clearly identify as trans, is presented as one of the villains. Fairly sympathetic villains, but villains. Like other queer characters, trans characters have historically been presented as evil or deviant in fiction. She does reflect a bit on her identity in a pretty touching inner monologue, shortly before, spoilers for Season 4, Episode 2, a brutal death at the hands of Overhaul. Honestly, this is one of the first times a character straight up dies in the series. The show does kill a bunch of people from here on out, but I could do a whole video on Bury Your Gaze. I'll just say, it's definitely a choice Horikoshi made. There is a nice scene after her death where her friends in the League of Villains correct Overhaul when he misgenders her, and I've never seen that before in a shonen show. Although I'll be focusing on the representation of the young cisgender women in my analysis, particularly representations of their bodies, I wanted to say that trans rights are human rights and womanhood is more than how you present or appear physically. Now, just because the show has more female characters who are treated better than many shonen and has some trans representation, that does not mean it's immune to criticism. And I have criticisms. Let's get into it. Like I mentioned, I have 2 problems with MHA's female cast. The first is the male gaze. The second is the lack of development for the female characters in the story. We'll begin with the first one, the male gaze. If you haven't heard the term male gaze before, you've definitely seen it. If you've seen MHA, you've seen it before. Male gaze is an idea in feminist theory that women in art are portrayed as sexual objects for the pleasure of a presumptive heterosexual male audience. There's a lot written about this idea, and if you're like, I'd be curious to read or watch more about that, I'm going to link some stuff in the description. But for analyzing MHA, it's that the women in the show exist as sexual objects first and characters of their own second. On a basic level, if the goal of presenting a female character a certain way is simply to make a presumed straight male viewer go, "That's hot," then female characters are treated as sexual objects first and characters second, if they're treated as characters at all. Think of panty shots, boob shots, tentacles, groping, all of that. This is what I'm talking about. In anime fandom, we tend to call this stuff fan service. Fan service is a more neutral term than male gaze, mostly because while fan service is implied to be for presumably straight male viewers, it can be for presumably straight women too. I'm going to stop saying presumably straight from here on out to be less wordy, FYI, since this is the default for the male gaze. Some might look at Free Iwatobi Swim Club and say, fan service exists for girls too. And yes, this is true. But Free is almost satire in a way. It's shameless about it. And there is one Free. There are a million shonen with massive amounts of fan service aimed at men. Because, the patriarchy. Male-oriented fan service hits a little different. Some see a male character with his shirt off and think, yes, there is no problem with fan service in anime. See this man. He's hot. Women will like that. And I'm sure many will. But a male character's chest is never going to be the defining trait of his character. It's never going to be something that other characters comment on all the time. It's never going to be what new characters react to first. It's never going to be that important. The anime Fairy Tail features Natsu and Lucy as two of the main characters. Natsu often doesn't wear a shirt. We get his abs and chest on display a lot of the time. Lucy often wears bikinis and similarly revealing outfits. Guess whose cleavage is constantly focused on by the literal framing of the show and the story itself? It's not Natsu. This is the male gaze, right? You could argue that both these characters are fan servicey because of their costumes being revealing, but the reason Lucy gets a different treatment in the world of the story is because of the male gaze. Here's a thing to keep in mind too. Women's bodies are not inherently sexual, erotic, sensual, whatever term you want to use. A character with large boobs is not inherently sexual or fan servicey because she has large boobs. That's how she is, that's how her body is. Period, end of story. What sexualizes a female character and her body, what furthers the male gaze, is the presentation of her body in a way that objectifies her. If you introduce a character with large breasts, great, if that's all you do. If you introduce a character with large breasts, and there's a prolonged scene where male characters are drooling at the sight of her and she's embarrassed or uncomfortable, and there's lots of close-ups of her boobs or other parts of her body, then you've sexualized and objectified a character right off the bat. If you've seen a lot of anime, the scene I just described is probably all too familiar. If a series shows us a part of a woman's body before we see her face or she gets to speak, a point I made in a video on here years ago, the manager Kyoko in Haikyuu is given a butt and a boob shot before we even see her face. Even if that show goes on to develop that female character, we still start off our perception of her by pure objectification. We do not see her as a person. We see her as parts of her body. I love these characters in the clips I'm showing on screen from Kuroko no Basuke, The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, and Haikyuu who get this treatment, but I think the inherent objectification of their bodies is wrong. Let's look at some MHA characters to see the male gaze in action, shall we? Now, I do think that fanservice / the male gaze can actually meaningfully serve the story or plot, but such a thing is very rarely done, and rarely done well. There's an example in the first episode of MHA, one of the very first scenes of the first episode. This bit of fanservice I don't hate as much as I normally would, because it serves the world building. We see a bunch of pro-heroes fighting this giant villain, and hero Kamui Woods is about to nab him when a hero making her debut, Mount Lady, finishes him off and claims credit for his defeat. We get a gratuitous butt shot, and she winks at the many cameras taking pictures of her, saying today is her hero debut, and she's pleased to make your ass-quaintance. Okay, I do hate this a lot. It's kind of terrible, which is my default position on most fanservice, but it actually tells us something about hero society and the world of MHA. Mount Lady is literally using her sex appeal to garner media attention to become a more prominent hero. In this world where heroes are both combatants and public figures, it makes a ton of sense that a new hero like Mount Lady would try to court the public in whatever way she can to get ahead. This is honestly a really helpful bit of information to give us in episode 1, because it draws an instant parallel between the hero culture of this world and the celebrity culture of our own world. In the same way, it's easier to become a famous celebrity if you're good-looking, young, cool. It's way easier to become a famous hero if you're good-looking, young, and cool. It gives us, the audience, an easy entry point to understanding the world of heroes. Did you have to draw this parallel using the male gaze? No. But at least a female character is keenly aware of how she can use the male gaze to empower her own hero celebrity. So, this is certainly one thing people point to with fan service to say, look, it's empowering, see? Women using their sexuality for their own purposes or as a weapon because it's an inherent part of their character. That's cool. And sure, sometimes characters have their sexuality interestingly tied into their identity and aesthetic in a way that makes their use of the male gaze a contribution to their character or the story, like Mount Lady in this one scene. But having watched quite a bit of anime and also having consumed a lot of media generally speaking, the large majority of male-oriented fan service does not have this kind of insightful character building that makes its presence feel warranted. Let's look at Bubble Girl. So, for Bubble Girl and the heroes to follow, much of this objectification stems from their costumes. They are revealing in a way that serves not their powers, but the male gaze. And I can hear it already. Oh, but it does serve their powers. It makes sense. This is a common counter-argument when you criticize fan service in anime. It serves the story or plot and therefore is excusable or expected. And, as I just explored, this occasionally has merit. But does fan service always serve the story? No. Hard no. For Bubble Girl, the practicality of this costume is non-existent. Her powers do not require underboob. She can make bubbles with specific smells. That's her power. Horikoshi did not actually design Bubble Girl. A fan did for a contest. He just picked this fan's character and design over, presumably, hundreds of other entries. I doubt there weren't hundreds of other entries with other interesting quirks and actually practical costumes. Why did he choose this one? What is so compelling about it? This is made more awful by the design stating that she was a 16-year-old. Horikoshi aged her up and made her 21. So she's an adult, and if this is how she wants her costume to be, more power to her. But the fact she was intended to be 16 and that the weird underboob thing is unrelated to her powers rubbed me the wrong way immediately. It got worse when she was chained up and tickled, quote-unquote, by her mentor Night Eye. Hey, what the hell does this serve other than some very particular fantasy for a straight male viewer? For Bubble Girl, there's none of that cool character building tied up in her sexualization. No theme, no relevance to her powers, no clear attempt to use her sex appeal to succeed in the hero industry. She has this costume because it looks cool and sexy, I guess, and it makes the scene extra titillating for a male viewer. What's the point? What is the point? This isn't to say you can't have sexy female characters who are just sexy. No other reason than that's how they are. Like, hell yeah, that's awesome. But it's possible to have a sexy female character in a way that doesn't objectify and belittle her, and most media fails to do sexy female characters in that way. There's debate to be had over how you portray women in media to be both sexy and empowered while not serving the male gaze, and I'm not going to solve it in a YouTube anime analysis video. But most of Horikoshi's female characters just aren't empowered. They are sexual objects. They are meant to please a male viewer first and foremost. Even if he was going for that perfect sexy but empowered feeling, I would say, well, this is bad interpretation of empowered sexiness. But he's not. Plus, not everything has to comment on the intricacies of the male gaze. Shonen manga aimed at primarily middle and high school boys might not be the best place for a strict interrogation of feminist perspectives. Of course, I'd be delighted if more authors did do this, but I understand why they might not. But you can't use the excuse, oh, this hypersexualization of a woman is empowering, if said woman is completely subject to the male gaze. It's sexist. That's it. A minor point, because I don't care very much about this character, but this is exactly how I feel about Midnight. Sure, there is an in-story reason for her to have a sex goddess getup. Her quirk releases an aroma from her body that puts people to sleep, and it works better on men. So somehow this means a dominatrix theme. But every aspect of this getup is done in a way to objectify her. Not to develop her character, not to explore how sex appeal works in hero society, not any meaningful engagement with the lives of sex workers. It's so, presumably, straight male viewers can look at her and go, that's hot, and objectify her. She low-key flirts with the students, and I guess it's a part of her power too, But it's so weird. I don't like her. Any aspect of her, honestly. We cannot forget that MHA doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not like the character has to be like this. An author created it. In this case, a man. He chose Midnight's powers, her costume, her presentation. He made choices for the world to be like this. Another thing people tend to say about fan service or sexualization in anime, or in any kind of media, is that there is sexism in the real world. Women are sexualized by real-life men all the time. We need to have that in our shows to be realistic. To this argument, I say, if you're going to include sexualization of characters for the purposes of realism, you need to meaningfully comment on issues of sexualization. I don't think Horikoshi is trying to make any sort of statement on feminist theory with the designs or treatment of his female characters. The closest we get is Mount Lady's sex appeal, and maybe the commercial with Snake, Momo, and Kendo, where female heroes are promoting a hairspray which makes them a lot of money. Which isn't much of a statement anyway. Everything else does nothing. There are shows that have commented on this, with varying degrees of success, but that is not what MHA is trying to do. Content warning for the times on screen for sexual assault and rape. This is an important but intense section of the video, so skip it if you need to. So, in the anime My Love Story, Takeo, our protagonist, stops a groper from assaulting love interest Rinko on a train. The story doesn't include this scene because they want male viewers to be titillated by it. They include it to showcase the horrible groping culture against women in Japan's public transit, and to show that our main character is absolutely not okay with it as he destroys this man. A more serious example can be found in the 2003 adaptation of Fullmetal Alchemist, not the more recent Brotherhood, with the character Rose. Rose lives in Lior, a city in the main setting of Amestris, which falls into a civil war after its theological leader, Cornello, is revealed to be a false prophet. And Rose is present to see Cornello's downfall. This story makes up the first arc of Fullmetal Alchemist. To stop the infighting, the state military of Amestris invades Lior. Both sides of Lior's civil war team up to fight the military, but the local population is still totally devastated. Rose was a leader of the Lior forces, but she is captured by the Amestris military and imprisoned for a year. When she emerges, she has a child, clearly implied to be the result of rape. The allusion to this rape is included to comment on the costs of imperialism and the suffering militaries enact on enemy civilians, especially civilian women. Rose, when we meet her again after these events, is a shell of who she once was, suffering immense PTSD from the abuse she suffered at the hands of Amestrian soldiers. This is meant to shock and disturb you, that this kind of character from the start of the series is a victim of the atrocities of war. It's not just random unnamed character suffering, it's someone you know and were fond of. Another example, the anime Banana Fish actually features a male main character who was the survivor of a sex trafficking ring as a child. And, of course, rape and sexual assault is an issue that affects both men and women. All of this to say, people do write female characters in terrible situations where they are victims of sexual assault to make meaningful points about their broader story and society. And that can be done very well, as I think it is in the examples I mentioned above. It's also easy to do this poorly. See my least favorite episode of Ouran High School Host Club, episode 8, for an introduction to victim blaming, for example. But Horikoshi isn't going for this. He's not trying to comment on sexual assault or sexualization at large. That was a little heavy, but important to address. All right, moving on. On to Momo. Oh, sweet Momo. So, Momo's quirk allows her to create objects from her exposed skin by transforming the structure of her fat cells. She has to have studied the molecular structure of any object she creates, but she's dedicated enough to have a lot of knowledge about different objects. So, she needs a costume that exposes a lot of her skin so she can produce large objects without large sections of her body being blocked off by clothing. Thus, this design was born. What? There are a lot of things wrong with this design. From a practical standpoint, the weird boob stripes of clothing create a very narrow shape for her to create stuff. Just a sturdy bikini would have been better. Support the boobs and give you not only your whole chest, but your whole back and sides. I guess if a bikini doesn't give Momo enough breast support, pretending we're in a reality where this outfit provides any support for a hot second, she could wear something with more coverage up top that still allows her entire chest and arms and back to use her quirk. Like a sports bra. The MHA stage show came up with another solution, not using Momo's original costume, but instead using a similar design with a zipper. When she's done, she can re-zip and she's all supported again. I can think of some many more designs, some that honestly would be sexier or more revealing, that are not this bizarre side boob thing. With Momo, there's also the aspect that she's 15 years old, eventually 16 in the manga. Do I find it weird and off-putting that a teenage girl, designed by an adult male author, wears this oddly impractical and revealing outfit? Yeah, I do. Everything I've discussed so far is made worse when applied to young girls, because you're presenting them as sexual objects, something to arouse not just boys, but men, when they're not adults and they shouldn't be presented in an adult context. It's one thing to find a teenage anime character cute, or call him or her your waifu or husbando, or write fanfic about them. I don't think people who do that are morally corrupt or anything. But the sexual element of it can be taken a little far, by fans and by authors. Clearly, the goal with Momo's costume is male titillation, and not anything more than that. The canon explanation of, she needs to show skin, is just a pretense for this impractically designed costume. It's more insulting when we spend so much time with Deku thinking about the exact details of his costume to best support his weak body, unable to accommodate his powers on its own. And Momo's is just, skin has to be shown, so here. Fans have done so many designs that are revealing but actually make sense. Some of these fall into the sexy but empowering bucket, for me at least. To be clear, for anyone without breasts, it can be so hard to run and even move without a bra on, so these outfits aren't just impractical in the sense of quirk compatibility, but also in the sense of comfort and ease of movement. Why would you expose your boobs in outfits like these and literally hinder yourself physically for no discernible reason? Especially when you're a hero who is paid to run around and save people. And, even in a bra, it can be cumbersome to move for larger-chested people. Sometimes people get breast reduction surgery if their boobs interfere in their movement enough. So, if you don't have the personal experience to understand, that might give you an idea of why something like this is just so baffling. So, to sum up this point, fan service and sexualization in MHA are not serving the story or plot. They are not empowering. They are not meaningfully commenting on sexualization in the real world. They are not even logical within the story. Oh no. Ugh. I should probably talk about the elephant in the room. Or the worst character in MHA, Mineta. If you've made it this far into the video, you probably aren't surprised that I hate Mineta with every fiber of my being. Here's the thing. If you don't find Mineta's jokes, quotes very much intended, funny, his character is literally useless. Mineta's backstory is that he was bullied, so he wanted to become cool and popular. And to become cool and popular, he wants to use women as a symbol of his own status. Therefore, he harasses girls in a way as bad or worse as the constant bullying he experienced that likely makes them feel uneasy and unsafe. He offers nothing to the story in any other sense. He only exists to make perverted jokes and objectify women. This is bad on its own. It's really bad and unacceptable. It's made worse by the fact that the good part of MHA, the super compelling story and characters, get undermined by this. If you're trying to build dramatic tension, and then this sniveling excuse for a character starts sexually harassing Momo, you are sabotaging your own story by taking all the steam out of the drama to make a terrible boob joke. Levity via comedic relief isn't generally a bad thing, but Mineta isn't funny. MHA has genuinely funny moments without Mineta, and those can be so good. Midoriya being really calm and collected and cool in the face of danger, and then BAM! Nerd mode where he goes on an internal analysis tangent is funny. As I'm writing, I'm wondering if I find this particularly funny because that's who I am as a person, someone who thinks way too deeply about things I'm obsessed with. But I googled MHA funny moments, and some of them were in there, so I feel justified, okay? Or like Bakugo being so angry all the time, over nothing. Or Kaminari getting zapped, or Momo being clueless about how rich she is. Or, I cannot stop twinkling! There's funny stuff that has nothing to do with harassing the young women of the cast. Let's take a look at some of Mineta's greatest hits, shall we? And by that I mean moments in which I desired to whack myself in the face so I no longer had to watch him on screen. They are so constant whenever he appears that I'll do just a few. When he groped Sue in the USJ attack, when he groped Momo in the beginning of the sports festival. How about the cheerleader outfits, where the girls are tricked into wearing cheerleader outfits by Mineta and You're on Thin Ice Kaminari? The two idiots tell the girls that they have to wear these outfits for a cheering competition, and they manage to trick Momo into making them, and also all the other girls into putting them on. Did none of the girls question this message from the biggest pervert in their class? Did no one ask if they should check with Aizawa? How did all the girls lose common sense? Momo even asks, why am I always falling for his stupid schemes? Like, shouldn't my canonically very intelligent character be able to see through this? Why does the author keep making it so it's like I'm super dumb? The sub has Present Mike ask, what kind of fan service is that? And the dub has him announce that the Class 1A girls are going full-on fan service. The look on the girls' faces suggests that, yeah, that's literally all this is. They are not happy about it. They were forced into these costumes for a totally nonsensical reason. The girls know it, and Horikoshi knows it. This is for titillating the male viewers, plain and simple. There is no story or character purpose. The manga just shows us the depressed lineup of girls, but the anime makes this even worse by, you know it, a butt and a boob shot. They're embarrassed, but basically roll with it at Toru's encouragement, and we get cute shots of them cheering. Yay! Blah. Then there's the training camp where he creeps on the girls. When in the class battles in the most recent season, in the middle of an intense fight, you think he came up with a clever plan to trip up the other team, and it's revealed to be ultimately a way to smush his face into Mina's boobs. Now, are you ready for the worst one? The one that is totally inexcusable? The one that if you're leaving me an angry comment that I simply do not understand the humor, you're going to have to stop and look me in the eyes and tell me is okay? When Mineta meets Eri, sweet 6-year-old Eri, the first thing he says is, I can't wait to see how you look in 10 years. I look at this scene, and I lose it. People love to say, he's just a teenage boy with hormones, what's your problem? I'm sorry, if a teenage boy in real life saw a 6-year-old girl and said, I want to see how you look in 10 years, I would slap him across the face and tell him to get away from that child, and tell his parent or guardian their son is atrocious and needs serious help. What is wrong with you if your first instinct when meeting a 6-year-old is to sexualize her? To say you can't wait for her to become a sexual object you can dehumanize like every other female character. Girls are not sexual objects for your pleasure. The worst part is Mirio makes a weird joke with his butt here that could have been the main joke. But no, we get that line from Mineta completely unnecessarily. And to zoom out, it's not just Mineta that said this. It's Horikoshi, the author, who made the choice to write a line that sexualizes a 6-year-old. Even for Mineta, this is a truly terrible line of dialogue. This was a distinct choice made, and I find that deeply upsetting. If you have been screaming that fiction is not reality, that she's not a real 6-year-old girl, that none of this matters, I'm here to tell you that, like it or not, fiction does affect reality. Media informs the way we see the world. It's not that someone watches this scene, an MHA, and thinks affirmatively that yes, now it's okay to hit on 6-year-olds. Nothing is that simple or obvious. It's watching anime, and TV, and movies, reading books, reading comics, where women and girls are again and again and again and again presented as sexual objects for men, that, even subconsciously, men begin to think of real-life women in that way as well. It is a pervasive and constant barrage of implicit and explicit messages telling men and women that this is how women should be presented. MHA, through all I have mentioned, is contributing to this. Okay, so that was all my first point about the male gaze. I still have a second point. Don't worry, it's a bit shorter, but I feel as strongly about it. The female characters in MHA are underdeveloped, especially compared to their male peers. Like I said at the beginning, I do think the female characters are better in MHA than a lot of shonen, but it's still not great. Let's look at Urakaka. She is a great friend to Deku and has a really incredible arc at the start of Season 2 during the sports festival, a fight that outlines anti-feminist shonen tropes and rebukes them. Urakaka is fighting Bakugo, who is clearly the favorite to win, and the crowd boos Bakugo for not going easy on Urakaka, toying with her, a poor little girl who got a rough draw going up against him. Present Mike even chides Bakugo for going all out. However, Aizawa as a commentator calls out the crowd for their own sexism in not treating Urakaka as a serious opponent for Bakugo. Bakugo was actually taking her quite seriously, not letting his guard down at all. Although she eventually loses, she puts up a remarkable fight, and Bakugo even seems excited about it. Afterwards, he learns her name, an honor not many of the extras in Class 1A have because Bakugo is, kinda terrible. Don't worry, I love him. When he returns to the stands with his other classmates, Kaminari reprimands him for fighting such a frail girl, but Bakugo just notes there was nothing frail about her. Bakugo Katsuki? Feminist icon? No, not at all. But it is a really good scene. What's so remarkable about this is how aware Horikoshi seems to be of the typical shonen narrative tropes, where even strong female characters are still treated as fragile or diminished in the eyes of the narrative for their gender. How he actively subverts this in that fight, and then just doesn't do much with Urakaka or all his female characters for the rest of the series. I'm slightly exaggerating, but the only character development Urakaka has had since the sports festival is realizing she has a crush on Deku, and being super flustered about it. She declares that she's setting aside her feelings to focus on becoming a hero, but she still seems pretty distracted by it. And she hasn't had much of a role in events since then. She had a good moment leaping into the fray with Deku in the class battles in recent episodes, but aside from that, not much. I consulted a friend who has read the manga, I'm in anime only, asking if perhaps she gets more involved in a later arc, and she just looked at me and told me that the sidelining gets worse. Now, she also said that pretty much the entirety of Class 1A gets sidelined, so it's not just Urakaka or female characters getting that treatment. But she added that there are new female characters who get very brief, badass moments before getting totally sidelined, or injured immediately. Let's look at a supporting character, Mina. She has such a cool power in my opinion, this kind of acid secretion. She gets one character moment in Kirishima's backstory, and it's quite interesting, but that moment is literally embedded in another more important, read male, supporting character's backstory. This moment isn't really about Mina. It's about Kirishima. And that would be fine if the supporting female characters were getting similar development. But they simply are not. Not to mention Mina is a frequent victim of the male gaze. Another point, let's look at the senior big three at UA. 2 guys, 1 girl. Cool, glad we have a young woman in the mix. Now, guess which 2 of the big 3 have significant development in arcs? Guess. Oh, it's the 2 guys. And no, it gets even worse, because Nejire, our resident big 3 lady, does get a big moment in one episode. What is it? Oh, she participates in a beauty contest. A beauty contest! Like, if I was writing a satire to demonstrate how you sideline interesting female characters while developing male ones, I'm not sure I'd be bold enough to straight up write arcs for 2 guys and then write a beauty contest for the girl. It's ridiculous. Another minor point about Nejire, the anime weirdly made her boobs bigger, which isn't itself an issue. Boobs are great. But the reason for this change is so they can add Mineta perving about her body. Like, there are several additions in the anime that aren't in the manga just for this to happen, like I mentioned with the cheerleaders. Horikoshi isn't at fault. Bones is. But it's really weird. Another thing that isn't Horikoshi's fault, the anime in general seems to make everyone, but especially the girls, skinnier. I actually quite like that the girls in MHA have realistic bodies. They aren't all stick thin. They've got thighs and roundness, and yes, I like that a lot. Sometimes I look at One Piece and all the distinct male character designs, and then the female characters who have one type of body that's just a stick with boobs and want to remove my eyes from my head and wander through the woods. So, MHA manga, good on you. But the anime said, no, stick thin, body diversity, who cares? Now, maybe non-skinny bodies are harder to animate, but if you can animate this, I think you can also properly draw Urakaka's chub. Alright, back to character development. It's no surprise that Deku and Bakugo and Todoroki are really central to the story of MHA. But it's a little shocking how, with a bunch of female supporting characters, you barely have one who has a main role, Urakaka. Horikoshi is certainly good at writing concepts for cool female characters at times. Actually executing and utilizing those concepts seems to be a struggle, though. It does not matter how amazing the female characters are on paper if we never actually see them involved in the story. There are female characters who get plenty of moments. Momo has her own little arc with Todoroki in their exam, Jiro has her arc with the school festival, Sue got that anime-only episode about her internship. But if we think about the plotty arcs, Urakaka's fight with Bakugo as an exception in the sports festival, there is a recurring set of characters who get to be a part of the action. Uh-huh. Okay. Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah, okay. When it's an exam or an internship or a festival, the girls get little moments to shine. But when it's real action and being heroes and fighting villains, they're background, at best. I don't deny that this is a shonen aimed at a male audience, but you can have great female supporting characters in a story about mostly male characters who get to be a critical part of the action. Horikoshi seems poised to do that, but he has chosen not to. What has he chosen to do with his female characters instead? Sideline. Sexualize. Sorely disappoint. The flip side of gatekeep, gaslight, girl boss. This is all compounded by the hypocrisy of having a moment like the sports festival, where it seems like Horikoshi is trying to comment on narrative sexism in shonen, juxtaposed with all the fan service through the rest of the series. It makes the entire scene read as faux feminism with no real meaning behind it. Trying to remark on the sexism of shonen treating young women as fragile rings completely hollow when you not only don't comment on the male gaze, but use it completely uncritically. If this was a show that didn't even pretend to have an interest in developing female characters, it would still be irritating to see a ton of fan service, but it wouldn't feel as frustrating as it does in MHA as is. MHA is but one strand in a huge web of sexism that makes up our pop culture. There are series far more sexist than MHA, but MHA is such a good show in other respects that it makes me even more frustrated that it fails so consistently to treat its female characters right. Acknowledging the sexist elements in a series, even as we enjoy the show as a whole, is important. Acknowledging the subtle and not so subtle ways the male gaze and sexism affect our viewing experience is important, and not just in MHA, but in all media we consume. One of the reasons I started this channel, over 5 years ago now, if you can believe it, was because I didn't see that kind of acknowledgement around issues of sexism in anime, largely because most of the prominent voices on anime YouTube are male. Of course, issues around sexism and feminism do sometimes come up in others' content, but I hope I offered a unique perspective and gave you something to think about as you watch MHA and watch other shows. Don't be afraid to think critically about something you love while still enjoying it. And don't be afraid to take seriously the sexism that's so often dismissed in media of all kinds. At the beginning of the show, Deku tells us not all men are created equal. He means this as a reflection on what it means to live in a society where most people have superpowers and some don't. But it resonates another way in this series, because while not all men are equal, men get to stand above women in terms of how much they are respected and utilized by the narrative time and time again. This is MHA's most unfortunate truth. Hi everyone! That was a long one, huh? Bit of a change of pace for my recent, kinda, content. But if you're a longtime fan, you may remember my very first video was about sexism in a then new sports anime, Prince of Stride. I'd like to know what you think in the comments about sexism in MHA or other shows you've seen the male gaze in. If you're this far in the video, I probably don't need to tell you to please comment having watched the whole video and be civil and thoughtful even if you disagree. But yeah, that would be nice. Wherever you are, I am sending you all the love, dear viewer. Until next time. Oh, but one more thing. See, I originally planned to make this video, 3 years ago, so I came up with an intro segment that would be joking about how no one had seen me for so long. But then the Ice Adolescence trailer dropped, and I was compelled by the power of Yuri on Ice to make a video. I did a joke about vanishing in that one too, but the MHA meme about my absence was so much more involved. I still think it's funny, so please enjoy this clip, all 3% of you who actually watch to the end of my videos according to my analytics. You earned it.
Don't stop twinkling.